And Summer, I see in the chat, you said the link didn't work for you. So thanks to Susan Z, our producer, for reposting it. Hopefully that will go ahead and work. If not, definitely take a screen grab of the handout when we get to it, or we'll see if we can add it to some of the technology to share with you afterwards as well. I promise we will make sure you can have it as we go through this. Okay, it looks like a couple of people did have some trouble, but then Summer, you were able to make it work. And Sarah, you were as well. So well done. Zoom technology champions. So what are we doing today in this financial wellness workshop? Specifically, I wanted to make sure to go over a framework for thinking about income and expenses in a very big picture kind of way. And I also wanted to make sure to list a few key metrics that you can use as you think about juggling all of the different things you're doing this year in particular, to think about how you are coping with some of the financial challenges you might be facing, and then also proactively moving towards a positive financial position. And then we wanted to apply this framework to what it's like to be a teaching artist. You will see in the handout, and yes, to Summer, it is just one page, super easy, and it's a quick snapshot of what this framework looks like and how you can think about using it in your role as a teaching artist, either to share with your students, if that's appropriate for what you're sharing with them, or more interestingly, to think about how you can use it in your own life. So as we think about this moment in time where we are, I have been struck by early on how the overwhelming ground rule for dealing with the global pandemic was to wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. And of course, that evolved to also wear masks and listen to the experts. And in thinking about what an equivalent ground rule might be for finance, it was interesting to me to think about the idea that doing the math and embracing and confronting the real numbers is sort of the equivalent ground rule when it comes to finance. It is very easy to get lost in the details or distracted by what might be going on, or a new fad or a new trend, but really going back to the basics and thinking about cutting out all the noise and really thinking about those few key metrics will be helpful in you as you build toward whatever your goals are. So here's a copy of the handout I mentioned. Now is a good time to take a screen grab if you weren't able to download the file. And you can see it's divided into basically 3 columns. There's a net worth column, a money out column where we'll spend most of our time, and then a money in column. And then you'll also see at the top 4 kind of key action items. This idea of knowledge, action, intention, and results is one I use with clients and students a lot. It's this idea that sometimes we need to know some things, sometimes we need to do some things or take action. Very often we need to focus on what we have control over and aligning that control with our intentions. And then it's also helpful to have a few key metrics or results to pay attention to. So that's how this framework is built. And it starts down in the middle, way at the bottom, with your costs to exist as a human in the way you want to exist. And I think it's interesting to start here because as you're thinking about what are your costs to exist as a human, that brings up some extra interesting questions like, who is covered by this number? Is it you? Is it you and your family, you and children, you and aging parents you might be caring for, you and a furry companion whose needs are as important as your own? And once you have an idea of who is covered with this number that needs to support your cost to exist as a human, it's interesting to go a little bit deeper and think about the personal costs you have to exist in the way you want to exist. And often, especially in the arts, we try to cut out any unnecessary expenses. And I would encourage you to think long and hard about what your priorities are and make sure you're including them in your expenses to exist as a human. Now, that doesn't mean the math will work out for you to be able to purchase anything you want to purchase ever, but I do think it's helpful to have an honest sense of what that number is to exist as a human in the way you want to exist. So if your favorite thing in the world is to go to yoga classes, you should probably include some number in your budget to cover going to yoga classes. The same is true if you enjoy really nice gourmet coffee, or if you love to travel, or if it's important to you to live in a space that is very comfortable and set up for your success. That's probably more important now in this pandemic moment in time than ever before. So I'd encourage you to think about this number in the context of including your priorities and what we call your UTILs, UTILS. That's an economic term that's an abbreviation for utility value. And those are the things that have a high level of value to you relative to their cost. I mentioned coffee earlier. I am a coffee drinker and I love a good cup of coffee. And this is an example of a high utility value item for me. I get much more value and enjoyment out of a cup of coffee than what it costs me to purchase that cup of coffee, whether I'm purchasing it out at my favorite coffee shop or if I'm purchasing it from the grocery store to consume at home. Either way, the value I get from it is high relative to its costs. That's something with high utility value. So I'd encourage you, as you're thinking about what your number is, to make sure it does include those high utility value items for you, and so that you're aware of what that real number really is. Very often, when I ask people what their number is, they will take a quick guess, and sometimes they're pretty accurate, and sometimes the number is quite a bit wrong. And what's interesting is how often some very common expenses tend to be forgotten when we think about what our real costs are. The amount you're spending on debt very often is something we don't remember to include in this number. But if you are making regular payments on student loans, or a car payment, or a mortgage payment, or even a credit card debt payment, that is something you are paying every single month. So that is part of your cost to exist as a human, even if it doesn't really come to top of mind because you may have already gotten the value out of that in the case of student loans, for example. We also often forget about the costs of insurance, sometimes because we make those payments annually. So anytime we have a payment that comes once a year or maybe irregularly, it's very easy to forget about those costs when we're thinking about our monthly costs to exist, for example. But also, if you have a W-2 job, as many teaching jobs are, your insurance costs are probably being withheld from your paycheck. So it's easy to think about you not really paying those costs, but you are. And if you're considering maybe leaving your W-2 job or thinking about exploring different opportunities, it's important to know what the cost of insurance is so you can make sure to replace it if you're pursuing different paths. The other costs we always tend to forget are costs that come up in the case of an emergency or because of any sort of irregular life experiences. Many people lately have been spending quite a bit of money getting their home offices set up so they can comfortably work remotely. That's an example of an irregular expense that might not happen on an ongoing basis, but it's important to include those types of things in your understanding of what it costs you to exist as a human. So to sum up this section, what you need to know is your dollar range to exist as a human, including whoever and whatever creatures are part of that number. What you're supposed to do with that information is check in with it regularly to make sure you're on track. I mentioned jotting down your number so you can see what it is, and then maybe in a month or so, looking back at your spending to see how close you were. And the things I'd like you to believe or carry with you with intention is this idea of your expenses aligning with your values, and also the idea that you are including your priorities in this expense number. In a few minutes, we'll get to how to fund all of these expenses, but I think it's important that you set your goal for what you want your costs to be, and then we can use our creativity to figure out how to fund those expenses. Moving up in the middle column, the next section is the cost to run your creative business in the way you want to run it. And you'll see there's quite a lot of overlap here. As you think about what you do, many of you may have creative studio practices in addition to your teaching work. Some of you may primarily be instructors, which is amazing. Some of you may be teachers on a freelance basis, so you're essentially running your own creative education business. It's important that you think through what the truth is for you about your creative business and what it really costs you to run this business in the way you want to run it. Some things to consider as you start thinking about that are very basically, what do you do? Whom do you serve? And what do you need to do what you do effectively for those you serve? And starting with those three questions can be a really interesting way to really get to the core of the value you're providing. Again, in going through this exercise with students and clients, there are often forgotten costs. Insurance tends to be a forgotten cost. If you are someone who regularly shows work or transports work or ships goods to clients or customers who purchase your work, or if you're someone that hosts teaching events or community events, sometimes those types of things have an insurance cost that sometimes we forget about or neglect to purchase, depending on kind of how aware we are of our insurance needs. So make sure you're thinking about that and understanding if that's a need you have. We also often forget about the cost for attending networking events or training events or marketing what we do. That is as important in running a creative business as it is in being an educator, especially if you are responsible for filling seats in your educational space. Oftentimes, we also forget about application fees or filing fees or any of those annual costs that come up with running a business. And very often we forget about reinvesting in the business, the idea that it's as important to have an emergency fund in your business as it is for your own personal life. So what you should do in this category is know the dollar range to run your business. And again, check in with it on a fairly regular basis. For some people, this is monthly. Depending on how active your business is, this might be quarterly or even annually. But it is okay to invest smartly in running your business effectively, even if that includes investing in things that we would call overhead expenses or administrative expenses, because it is very important that you are running your business well so that you can do your best work. The next category of things, as we move up in that center column, is your tax category. As Sheila mentioned, I'm a CPA and I deeply, deeply love tax law and policy. I find it absolutely fascinating. And so when we think about things we spend money on or what we do with our money on a regular basis, taxes are part of that conversation. So I'd encourage you to think about how much you pay in taxes every year. If you are an employee and all of your income comes from what I would call a W-2 job, that's a pretty easy number to figure out. You can look at your most recent pay stub and see what has been withheld for federal, state, and local taxes. If you also have freelance work, or if you sell work, or you do additional work outside of being an employee somewhere, you also have additional income, and there is probably not taxes being withheld on that additional income. So it's important for you to set aside the taxes that you may eventually need to pay. If those amount of taxes are going to be more than $1,000 or so for a year, then you may want to think about making estimated tax payments throughout the year. Or if you are someone who has a W-2 job and also some income from additional sources, you can always ask your W-2 job to withhold a little bit extra in taxes. You can visit the HR office or whoever is in charge of payroll at your company and share with them the amount you think you might earn from other sources throughout the year, and they can help you do the math to figure out how much in extra taxes to withhold so you don't even have to worry about estimated tax payments. In general, I think if you are making income from outside of a traditional W-2 job, you may want to think about setting aside maybe about 30% of what you're earning. That should be more than enough to cover your federal, state, and local taxes. Although that's just a starting point kind of rule of thumb, you can also use last year's tax return and take a look at it to see what you actually paid in taxes and see what your effective tax rate is. That's the amount of taxes you paid divided by your total income. And that can give you a sense of how much you might want to start setting aside if you are responsible for paying some of your own taxes out of pocket. So again, key things to know for taxes, your effective tax rate, or if you don't want to go too deep, maybe just keep the number 30% in mind, because if you are earning income as a freelancer or a contractor, setting aside about 30% of what you earn in taxes is not a bad strategy. You also want to make sure that you are actively setting aside some money for taxes. Very often, especially if people unexpectedly have income from outside sources during a year, they forget about their tax obligations. And then there's kind of an unpleasant surprise when they file their taxes at the end of the year. So one action you can take is to proactively set aside some of what you're earning to make sure you don't find yourself in that surprising situation. And it's important that you believe and have the intention to manage your tax obligations because you are fully capable of doing it. It's not always pleasant or fun or easy because much of the information is not designed to be super accessible, but you are fully capable of navigating it. So now we move on up in that middle column and we come to this fourth category. And this is the category of savings. It's in this column of money out or things that you spend money on, because I'd like you to think about actively spending money on yourself or actively spending money on your savings during the year. That means intentionally setting aside some money to increase your emergency fund and to increase your long-term savings. So savings for retirement, for example, or some other long-term need. And this is a really interesting way to think about your savings because very often savings is treated as something you can do when there's extra money. But as we all know, in service professions, as educators and as artists, very rarely is there extra money. Almost always we earn enough to cover our expenses and not necessarily a lot more. But I would challenge you to articulate what your own active savings goal is. How much do you want to be saving for both the short term and the long term? And think of that as an expense in the same way your taxes are an expense, or your rent or mortgage payment is an expense, or annual dues to an organization you love is an expense. Because I think it's helpful to have a sense of what your real total costs are, including your cost to exist as a human, your cost to run your business in the way you want to run it, and your taxes and your savings. Because by thinking of those costs and aiming for that total number, then we can use our creativity to figure out ways to fund that total number with intention so that we're not hoping there will be something left over for savings at the end of the year. We are intentionally planning for there to be enough to cover our savings and our taxes and our costs. So as we think about this savings amount, specifically when it comes to short-term savings, it's interesting for you to think about how much you can realistically add to your emergency fund each month. And then it's also interesting to think about what's your total goal for your emergency fund or for your short-term savings amount. Sometimes I use those terms interchangeably. In either case, what we're thinking about is enough money to cover short-term needs if something goes wrong. The general rule of thumb is to have enough cash on hand. Now, that doesn't mean actual cash you can touch, but cash in a checking account or a savings account that you can access quickly to cover about 6 months worth of expenses. And you know what your expenses are because you've already figured them out. You know what your costs to exist as a human are and your costs to run a creative business. So if you think about those costs on a monthly basis and multiply that by 6, that can be your goal for your emergency fund. If that feels like it's way too big of a number, start smaller. Aim for 1, and then 3, and then 6 months. And then once you've hit 6 months, maybe stretch that out to about 12 months. I think if you are the primary breadwinner in your family, or you are the primary provider for others that are counting on you, and if your income tends to fluctuate, if you have very stable income, you can probably get away with a 6-month emergency fund. But if you are someone whose income fluctuates pretty dramatically, depending on what's going on in the world, you may want to aim to save about 12 months worth of expenses in that easy to access account. And that's the answer to the question, where am I going to put it? Very often, people have lots of questions about investments, which I love. That is a great conversation to have. But it's important that you have some money that is not invested, that is just sitting waiting for you in case you need it. We've seen all too many examples in 2020 about how important this is. Many people were laid off, and even though there were unemployment benefits available and even extended unemployment benefits available, there was often a fairly long period of time between when someone became unemployed and when they actually started receiving their benefits. Now, the benefits were retroactive, meaning they covered the full period of unemployment, but someone with no savings was in a pretty precarious position if they had to wait 5, 6, maybe even 8 weeks before receiving that first check. This is why you need some sort of short-term savings, so that you have some money to draw upon in case you need it. It's also important to think about long-term savings. Much in the same way we do with short-term savings, we want to think about how much you are adding to your retirement account each year. And then, are you on track? Depending on where you are in your career and how old you are, there are different calculators available that can give you a shortcut kind of benchmark to see if you're on track for what you may need to save in order to retire comfortably. But that's an important exercise to go through. And it's also important to remember that there are probably retirement benefits you can access through your employer, especially as an educator. There are often very, very delightful retirement benefits you can tap into. But if you have any self-employment income as well, there are additional self-employment retirement benefits you may want to think about. Something like a SEP plan, S-E-P, a simplified employee pension, could be a good option, or a simple plan as well. Both of those function as IRAs, essentially, if you have self-employment income. So know there are some options available to you. The most important thing is to plan to make these contributions, because otherwise there might not be enough funds left over at the end of the year to make them actively. How you're going to invest these funds is another interesting question, and this is where people generally start to get excited about some of the investment opportunities they have. And once you have maxed out your retirement benefits for the year, and once your short-term savings are in a really healthy place, then it could be time to think about other long-term investment options that you might be able to take advantage of. So, your quick recap here about savings. What you should know is your savings rate. So what percentage of your income are you actively trying to save? A good benchmark is 10 to 15% of your income, but you get to decide what makes the most sense for you. If percentages aren't your thing, you can also think about the amount of dollars you want to aim to save on an annual or monthly basis. You can also think about it in a slightly different way. One of my former colleagues found that percentages and dollars felt too abstract to him. So he figured out what his hourly rate was based on his salary. And he made a commitment to himself that he was going to save 1 hour every week. So that meant he took essentially 1/40th of his salary every week and automatically directed that to a savings account. And for him, it was easier to think through savings and priorities based on hours instead of percentages or dollars. Percentages and dollars felt too abstract, but it was really easy for him to get a handle around, all right, of the 40 hours I work every week, one of them is giving me income for my savings. And that's an approach that worked for him. So feel free to borrow that if it works for you as well. It's also useful to know what the total balances are in your short-term and long-term savings. Now, I don't think you need to check in with this number too frequently. Quarterly is probably fine for your long-term savings, maybe monthly for your short-term savings, especially during a year when that number might be fluctuating a lot. But it's good to have an idea of what that total balance is. So 2 things to know: how much are you actively adding to your savings? And then what's the total balance within your savings? We would want to see both of those going up over time. And then what should you do? Well, take the action to contribute regularly when and if you can. And then take the action to review your investments annually, especially for those retirement or those longer term savings accounts, because that's not a bad thing to check in with once a year or so. And again, if you plan to save, and if you think of this as an expense that you are investing in yourself, just as you have expenses for food and shelter and clothing and your creative business, then you can take the steps to proactively save. So that's our middle section. Money out. It's going to your costs as a human, your costs to run a business, your taxes, and your future in terms of your savings. There are plenty of pitfalls that come up in this middle section, and I've proposed a handful of solutions here that work to overcome some of those pitfalls. Typically, the issues that come up in this middle section are underestimating what our costs really are or what they really should be in order for us to live as we want to live, or pay our taxes in full, or run our businesses in the way we want to run them. We also tend to think about shorter term needs and our expenses instead of savings. And that is easy to do. And I am very sympathetic to that plight, especially for creative individuals and educators whose income is often very tight. There is often not a lot of room to spend less on your expenses, which is why I would advocate for you to make more money rather than trying to spend less, because you will never be able to eliminate enough expenses for you to be able to retire comfortably. I think we need to reframe our thinking so that we're aiming for a higher target that realistically covers all of your needs, and then use our creativity to fund that target. And so that's where we're moving next. We're taking these total costs and using them to inform your goal for your earnings or your income. We want to make sure you are earning enough to cover all of your realistic costs, to cover your taxes, and to enable you to proactively save money. So that moves us to the right side of your handout when we think about money that you have coming in during the year or during the month from various sources. And my favorite way to think about the money you have coming in is using this portfolio career framework. And a portfolio career is simply an approach to match your strengths, the things you do really, really well, with opportunities to monetize those strengths. And I like to think of this in terms of having 3 major categories within this framework. The first category is your starring role. That is your thing. That is what you would do if you could do anything in the world. And in a perfect world, your starring role would pay you enough to cover all of those expenses you have. And for some individuals I work with, that is absolutely true. But for others, sometimes it takes them a little bit more time to develop a market for their starring role work, especially if the starring role work they do is creative in nature, but also if part of their starring role is being an educator. because it's really important to prioritize what you want to focus on in the starring role. And in some cases, the income for educators is set and there's not a lot of flexibility there. If you do have flexibility, though, it is important that you are setting appropriate rates for your time, your services, or your goods, or your art, whatever it is that you're selling. And that tends to be the biggest challenge when it comes to earning money from your starring role. Your supporting cast role works are the next category. These are things that are related to your starring role, but they're not exactly the same thing. So maybe you think of yourself as an artist first, and maybe that is your starring role, and maybe you take on teaching work in support of your starring role. You still love the teaching work, and it provides lots of opportunity for you to deepen your knowledge, for you to make amazing connections in the field, and for you to connect with potential audiences for your work. That's an example of a supporting cast role work for someone who identifies as an artist first. But maybe for you, your starring role is being an educator. A supporting cast role work might be taking some of the curriculum you've developed and licensing it for use by other educators or by other individuals. That's not exactly teaching. It's taking something you've created that has value and monetizing it in a slightly different way. It's still supporting your starring role. It's still building up your expertise and your reputation as a leader in the field. And it's also providing a little bit of additional income. Either way is perfectly fine. You get to decide what you categorize as starring role work or supporting cast role work. The challenge is just to figure out where different opportunities fall, and especially when it comes to supporting cast role work, to make sure you are balancing the income you earn in this category against the time you're spending in this category. It is very, very easy to spend a lot of time in the supporting cast role category, especially if you find yourself having lots of opportunities in this area. But if you spend too much time in this category, you won't be able to develop and devote the time you need to really grow your starring role. So that's the trade-off you're facing in the supporting cast role category. With starring role, the challenge is to set appropriate rates for your work or your time. With supporting cast roles, the challenge is making sure you are spending the right amount of time there, but not too much time so that it detracts from your starring role. And the third category tends to be my favorite. It's the production assistance work category. Now, I am certain you have noticed the performing arts metaphor that's running through this framework. This is the idea that if you have any experience in performing arts world, the star on stage very often gets most of the attention, but there are key supporting cast role members that often make the star better and make the production better. And none of this would happen at all were it not for lights and stage managers and directors and costumes and all the behind the scenes things that enhance a production, but that the audience doesn't usually see. That we call production assistance work in the context of your portfolio career. The production assistance work is the work that is temporary, repeatable, and stable, and you can go back to it if you need it, but it's not exactly helping you grow your starring role. It is keeping you in the game, it's providing stability or predictability in your schedule, but it's not necessarily where you would ideally want to be spending your time. Classic examples of this in the arts tend to be waiting tables, or being a valet, or babysitting, or dog walking, or having a temp job or an office administrative job. Anything like that that's providing stability to your life, especially your financial life, but not necessarily providing connections or other intangibles that are really helping your starring role, falls into this category. It's important that with this category, you are very clear on what you are getting out of this work. Maybe it's money, maybe it's benefits, maybe it is predictability in your schedule. Maybe it is having a job where there is infrastructure to withhold taxes so that you don't have to pay your own estimated taxes. Any of those things are fine, but it's important that you are clear on what benefits you are getting out of your production assistance work, because you get to decide how these three categories of work come together in order to help you earn enough to cover all of your costs to exist as a human, including savings and taxes and all those other things. I'll pause here because that's quite a lot of information in this framework. I haven't seen any questions come through the chat. I've still been keeping an eye on it, but I'll pause here to see if you have anything you'd like to add. All right, I don't see anything, so I'm going to keep going. Definitely put those questions in the chat if you have them. When we think about these three categories, and again, there are lots of different examples that can come into these categories, and you get to decide what makes sense for you. It's important that we know the amount you're earning from each category based on how you define the categories. I think it's helpful to set a goal for how much you want to earn from each category, and then also track the actual expenses the actual income you are earning from each category. So let's give an example of that. Maybe you are a writer and you teach a writing class and you help young writers find their voice, but you also publish work through your publisher. So you have royalties coming in twice a year or so. And maybe you also work as a copy editor on a freelance basis. That way you can look at your own numbers and say, okay, I earn money from teaching. Maybe for you, that's your starring role, but you also earn royalties and you also earn money from editing work, right? You can decide if that's the breakdown you want, or if you'd like to be making more money from teaching so that you could spend less time editing. Or maybe you make the choice that you would like to spend less time editing so that you can proactively work on the next piece of writing you've been working on to then increase the royalties you might get from those future writings. I see a question in the chat about why it's important to know how much from each category. I think it helps you align your vision for your career with the numbers. And it gives you a little bit more intentionality instead of you being subject to the whims of the marketplace. If your goal is to earn 30% of your income from your starring role work and 70% from your supporting cast role work, that can help you make decisions about which work to say yes to and which opportunities to pursue. Or maybe you look at your numbers and you say, okay, currently I'm earning 10% from my starring role work. And in 5 years, I would like to be earning 50% of my income from my starring role work. All of a sudden, that's a tangible goal that we can start making a plan to work toward by identifying other opportunities within your starring role category, or maybe having a conversation about the prices you set for your work or your time to see if there are any adjustments we can make there. So that's why I think it's important to know. The other reason I think it's important to know is that sometimes at different points in our lives and in our careers, we need to draw upon that production assistance work. I think this year in particular, we've seen that a lot. There's an animator I work with who does amazing animation work, but he was really thrown for a loop when the shutdown happened and when the quarantine happened. All of his animation work dried up and he was starting to panic a little bit, even though he had some money saved. For him, he was in a place where he didn't feel like he could create work he was proud of, especially during March, April, and May. But he also didn't feel like he was in a position where he could just stop working entirely. So he took a job at a distribution center. And for some people, that might be seen as a failure. The idea that this animator was taking a job in a distribution center. We would call that production assistance work that was supporting financially his starring role, but it wasn't necessarily moving him forward in his starring role in a way that a supporting cast role might have. But for him, he knew he was getting stability and predictability and some calm out of having that job. He was very clear on what he was getting out of it, and it helped that he was getting additional pandemic pay on top of his normal salary for that work. So for him, it was an easy decision to make to pursue that particular opportunity at a time in his life when he really was craving a little bit more stability. And what ended up happening is he found himself in a more relaxed place so that he could be doing better work on his days off. Now, does he wish he had more time to spend in animation? Absolutely. But he was very clear on why he made the choice he made, which means he can look back at this moment in time as a victory for himself, right? And when he's ready, he can stop that job and focus more on his starring role work, his animation work. And that's okay. I think being able to know where you are, where you want to be, and why you're making choices at different points in your career gives you all the power to be able to make those choices on purpose. It's also important to know what the appropriate rates are for your work or your time. There are lots of different ways of calculating these. My favorite approach is to think about it from a holistic point of view. So you want to make sure that the rates you're charging for your work or your time are covering your costs, absolutely, but they also need to reflect your customers' willingness and ability to pay. Especially in arts and education, we know that customers aren't able always to pay. They might be very willing, but depending on who your students are, they may or may not have the ability to pay tuition for a class you might teach. So thinking about ways of meeting your customers where they are as you're setting your rates, and also finding income from other sources, like a grant, for example, or a scholarship sort of program, enables you to continue to collect the appropriate rate for your work or your time while acknowledging your customer's point of view. And it's also important to know what your competitors are charging. It's important that you have an understanding of where you fall within the landscape. And then most importantly, when it comes to setting your rates, it's important to know what your strengths really are and the value you're bringing to whatever it is you are providing to those you serve. Because that's where the real value is coming from. It's coming from your strengths, your competencies. And to the extent that you can prioritize those and explain them, it's helpful to dive in a little bit deeper there. There's a question in the chat from Dr. Parker. Dr. Parker says, are there also multiple sources of income? Yeah, in the animation example, where the animator was making income for freelance animation work, also some freelance animation editing work he was doing, and then also earning money as a distributor, I would definitely call those multiple sources of income. And then another question from Paul in the chat. Paul asks, can I recommend sources to determine what's the appropriate rates for your services? And Paul shares he's a teaching artist / educator. That's a great question, Paul. I would say you can always start with Google. That's not my favorite place to start, but you can do a quick search just to see what comes up in your area. You can also do some research in contacting different colleges and universities or K-12 settings or even community settings to see what the rate is or the going rate from different potential clients you might work with. Depending on whether you teach college students or young children or members of the community, those rates can vary pretty widely. And what's interesting about the idea of rates for teaching services is that they very often are quoted in terms of a class or a workshop. So if you are an adjunct instructor at the college level, you will be paid a flat amount for the semester probably in 4 installments. Or if you are teaching a workshop in a community setting, you might be paid a flat amount for that 2-hour class or workshop. What's interesting is that amount very rarely covers all of your preparation time and also all of your assessment time. So when you start breaking it down on an hourly basis for your preparation and your assessment time, in addition to the time spent teaching and critiquing students, then the number starts to become very depressing very quickly. So it's interesting to think about the real value that's going in at all those different points of the teaching experience, and to the extent that you can, have a conversation with whoever's setting the rates about that amount, and then also maybe strategize for additional sources of income. So let's pretend, Paul, you are someone who teaches workshops at a community center. And maybe the community that is served has a budget for what they pay their instructors, and it is what it is. You could think about helping them identify additional sources of income, whether that is individual donors who are maybe willing to pay for their own tuition to attend a class and also support someone else's tuition, sort of like an informal scholarship program at the community center level, or maybe through grants or partnerships from the community that can help to underwrite what you're doing. So maybe you are someone who teaches design theory and 3D printing techniques. Maybe you find a community partner that could help sponsor the class and help offset some of the supplies cost or something like that, and maybe help support your honorarium as well. There's another question in the chat. Oh, and I see a number of people have added resources in response to Paul's question, which is fantastic. Definitely bookmark those resources and check them out. Dr. Parker mentioned, how about garnering testimonial for marketing for doing jobs you do almost for free? He goes on to say, in other words, you make marketing value from some underpaid work. I love this idea. I think what's really interesting about this is the way you describe it. You say that you're intentionally getting those testimonials. Sometimes we think about, especially in the arts, if we do something, it will just be nice, and then people will say nice things, and then it will lead to better things. And we tell ourselves that story a lot. I think in this particular example, there's a tangible example of how you can get a testimonial from that experience that you can then use to carry forward to your next experience. I think also if you are able to get any sort of collateral marketing materials. So maybe these are images of you teaching or images of the classroom setting with permission, of course, depending on the age of the participants you're photographing, or maybe even some video footage. I think that sort of marketing collateral you could use to build going forward as you grow your practice and lead to more teaching opportunities. Raymond asked, how would I license a class, as mentioned earlier? Great question, Raymond. There are a handful of websites that do allow you to post things and then license them. Teachers Pay Teachers is one such option where instructors will often post their curriculum and other teachers can pay them very nominal amounts for use of that curriculum. I also think if you are active in industry groups, very often there are state level or regional industry groups, not unlike this one, that allow people to share resources. You could also think about publishing them through your own website and allowing people to download them for a small fee or something like that. It kind of depends how much work you want to put into setting up the platform to make that work available. Paul asked the question, does the rate change because of remote teaching? What a great and timely question, Paul. Here's my response. I would argue that no, the rate you charge should not change because of a remote setting as opposed to an in-person setting. And here's why I would argue that. The value of what you provide hasn't changed. The value of you as an educator helping your students see the world differently or develop their technique or develop their point of view as an artist, that work is still continuing, even if how you're doing that work has changed. But I don't think the change in how you're doing the work has any impact on the value that you're providing. And so that's how I would frame the response to that question. It's tempting to also say that no, your rates shouldn't change because your costs have actually probably gone up. You might be purchasing a Zoom subscription or a new microphone or a higher quality camera so you can see your student work better. But the fact that your costs have gone up very rarely is a compelling argument for those you serve to pay more. I find if you can describe the value of what you do and the value either maintaining or increasing in these uncertain times, I think that's a more compelling argument for those you serve. A few people have amplified the additional links and materials that are shared in the chat. Thank you so much. I think Kat was sharing quite a few of those. Thank you, thank you. Yep, the Teaching Artists Guild pay calculator is a great resource. And there's a point in the chat about how that can help administrators recognize what they should be paying you, which is a bigger conversation. I hope you leave this conversation on financial wellness, knowing what the target amount you would like to earn is to cover all of your savings and taxes and everything else, but also with some support among others to help to have that conversation with others who are signing those checks, because they don't doubt the value that you are providing. They're just struggling to prioritize all the different competing interests they might be valuing right now. But continuing to remind them of your value, I think, is absolutely crucial. Okay. I don't think I missed any more questions in the chat. Sheila, definitely let me know if I missed any more. Oh, Paul, you said you need me in New York. Thank you. I get to go to New York very often, so we should connect next time I'm there. The other stuff on this handout on the far left are your assets and your debt. Remember, your assets go up when you save money, right? That increases your assets. And as you pay off your debt with those monthly payments you're making, more than the interest, including the interest and the principal, that makes your debt go down. And that's what we like to see. So that's our framework for the day. You've got the handout either through screen grab or downloading it through the chat. Definitely make sure you refer back to it and continue to use each other for support. With that, I will turn it back over to Sheila to close out this session.
Well, thank you, Elaine, and thanks to everyone for attending today's session. Before we end, we would love to take a minute to hear from you on how this workshop resonated with you. Our producer will now post a quick poll for you to complete. While you're doing that, I just wanted to let you know, again, remind you that recordings of this workshop and others will be available on NASA's YouTube page within the week. Look to the chat to see a link to our Facebook page, which I am getting ready to post here. There we go. If you're not already a member of the Facebook page, please join it, because not only will we be talking about things here, but we would like to keep connected with everyone beyond the retreat. Please join us there to offer your reflections on today's workshop. Also, watch your email box for a brief survey every Friday of the retreat to let us know what you think. So the 2020 Mid-Atlantic Teaching Artists Virtual Retreat is a co-sponsored project of the Mid-Atlantic State Arts Agencies in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. We are grateful for the generous support of all these collaborators and grateful for your participation today. Thank you and goodbye.